subject for today is the question of why Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not in the Haggada. And the question is, where would you look for the answer to a question like that? Why something isn't there? You know, most of the Mepharshim deal with the things that are there. How do you look for something which isn't there? In this instance, it seems that the answer is embedded in something which is written in the Haggada. The Haggada emphasizes the idea that the redemption from Mitzrayim was V'yotzienu Hashem Mitzrayim lo ayidei malach, lo ayidei sarach, lo ayidei shliach, ela HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvaro v'atzma. There's an emphasis in this idea that the redemption from Mitzrayim, meaning the Makas B'charos, was not done through an agent, not through a malach, but it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvaro v'atzma, in His honor, in His glory, Himself. And it would seem that's why Moshe Rabbeinu is marginalized. To emphasize this idea that it really was not done through an agent, rather through the Ribono Shel Olam alone. So before we tackle the question as to why Moshe Rabbeinu is not mentioned, let's talk about this other concept. Why is it so important that the redemption should have been HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvaro v'atzma? Why could it not have been to an agent? And the Mepharshim give various suggestions. Some say that the Makas B'charos could not have been done to a malach because it was necessary to discern who in fact was the B'chor. You know, there are many people, many women in Mitzrayim had children with several men. So the mere fact that a child was not apparently the oldest did not mean he wasn't the B'chor. He may have been a younger child and still a firstborn of the particular father. So therefore, only HaKadosh Baruch Hu could know that. He's the one who could be mavchen bein tipa shel b'char to tipa shel eina b'char. So perhaps that's why it had to be. They say a vertical from the Arizal that Mitzrayim was so corrupt that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have sent the malach also would have become corrupt. Fardor, say in Yiddish. So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to descend Himself. I'd like to share with you a thought the Maral says. But to fully appreciate this thought, we have to explain another piece of the Haggada. Near the end of the Haggada, we say that B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam liros es atzmo kilu yatzim Mitzrayim. In every generation, a person has to see himself as if he left Mitzrayim. Shneimar, as it says, Ba'avur zeh also Hashem li b'tzeisim Mitzrayim. That we observe the mitzvahs because of what God did for me. And this is being spoken not by people who actually left Mitzrayim, rather their descendants, and nevertheless they refer to the Yetzias Mitzrayim as something which they personally experienced. So from here we see that a person has to see himself as if he left Mitzrayim. Not only did HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeem our forefathers, but we were redeemed as well. Shenemar, there's another pasuk, that God took us out, Laman Havi Osanu, in order to bring us to Eretz Israel. Now, anybody who's sensitive to the way Chazal speak will understand that there really are two different ideas over here, because we see that the Haggada has to bring two different supporting psukim. To the first statement of B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam liros es atzmo, the proof text is Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li. To the second statement of Lo asav aseinu b'uvad of Go'al HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we bring a second proof text. Shenamar v'osanu hotzi misham. So the fact that we have to bring two different proofs means we're talking about two different propositions. The noteworthy difference between the two is that in the first one, Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li, the Father refers to Himself but excludes the Son. As we know from earlier in the Haggada, li v'lo lo. Right? The Father refers to Himself, not to the child. In the statement of Osano Hotzi Misham, the Father says, God took us out. He's saying this about himself and the son together. Now, the simple answer to that question is that the first pasuk is a reference to the Ben Rasha. So the Ben Rasha excluded themselves. To him, the father says, "Leave lo lo." The pasuk of Osanu Hotzi Misham is in Parshas Veschanan, in the parsha of the Ben Chacham. The Ben Chacham doesn't exclude himself. Therefore, the father says Osanu. That would be the simple answer to the question. But there might be another idea here as well. When we talk about this idea that in every generation a person has to see himself as a B'daf Mitzrayim, I think there are at least two different ideas that are included over here. The first is an exercise in imagination. In other words, despite the fact that the reality is that it was my forefathers that were redeemed and I was not there, but b'chol dar v'dar chayev adam liros asasma. A person is obligated to see himself, meaning he has to imagine himself as if he was there. In other words, it's an exercise of the imagination. Why is it important to imagine that you were there? Because we know that the impact of an event certainly is stronger for those who experience it firsthand than for those who merely hear about it. And we know that the miracles of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Makos and the Makas Becheres, these really are the basis of our faith, as the Ramban explains. It was from these miracles that we came to understand God's omnipotence and His omniscience, His concern for us. So therefore we don't want that experience merely to be a second or third or 10th-hand experience. We want it to be something which we ourselves see vividly, clearly, sharply. And therefore in every generation we have to use our imaginations. And, close your eyes, sit back, imagine what it's like to be enslaved in the hot desert, building buildings, doing agricultural work, being subject to taskmasters and the whip, to witness such fantastic miracles and wonders, using our imaginations. So our reinforcement of faith and belief is stronger than it would be if it was merely a verbal report. That's one aspect of that. In that sense, when the father speaks to his son, if the son is the Ben Rasha, and the son excludes himself from this exercise, then the father is justified in saying, leave alolo. In other words, if I'm only using the first person because I engage in this exercise of the imagination, and you clearly are not engaged in that, you're not willing, you're not involved, you exclude yourself, so therefore I'm justified in saying, leave alolo. This is something which I experience using my imagination. Obviously you aren't participating in that exercise. But there's another aspect, which is this, that the reality is that we were redeemed. It's not just an exercise of imagination. It's a reality. And the Maharal explains this very beautifully. He says like this. He says that when a human being does something for a person, if I do you a favor, even though that favor may affect your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, nevertheless you would not say that I did this favor for your children. I did it for you. The benefit that comes to your children, your grandchildren, was perhaps intended, perhaps unintended, but I certainly didn't do it for them. I did it for you, and there are consequences. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu acts, it's not that way. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu acts, He has all the future generations in mind. Something He does for you, He is not doing just for you. He's doing it because He knows this will be for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, and all of that is intended, and to Him is just as important as you are. It isn't secondary. It's primary. It's equal. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's concern is for you and all the people who will be affected by what He does for you. I always say, not jokingly, but seriously, that whenever you eat an orange, you have to understand that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the first orange trees in the Sheshis made Rashis, He had you in mind. It wasn't that He made the trees and now it happens to be that you're eating the orange which is from a 10th generation offshoot of that tree. As HaKadosh Baruch Hu foresaw at the very outset that this tree would give birth to many oranges whose seeds would be planted and many other trees would grow and they would produce oranges which in turn you would eat. that all was intended. That was all part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's kavanah. So every orange, in addition to having sun-kissed on it, also has your name on it. Your name is on that orange. It was brought into the world for you. And that's the sense of Osana Hotzimisha. That God took us out. Meaning it wasn't just that our forefathers were taken out and we are the unintended or perhaps even intended but secondary beneficiaries. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu performed the Yetzias Mitzrayim, it was for each and every one of us. In this sense, you can't exclude the Ben Rasha. If Ben Rasha is here, he was also included. Maybe he wouldn't have had the merit to be redeemed, and maybe had he been there, he wouldn't have been redeemed, but he wasn't there. He's here. And therefore, for some reason, which perhaps is inexplicable to us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that he's worth redeeming. Again, had he been there, maybe he wouldn't have been redeemed. But he wasn't there. He's only coming into the world 10 generations later, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeemed his great-great-great-grandfather with him in mind. Which is a mystery, why that should be. But that obviously is the case. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu intends all the consequences, and this person is here, then obviously HaKadosh Baruch Hu had him in mind. And therefore, in that sense, you can't exclude the Ben Rasha. That's Osana Hotzi Misham. When the father speaks to his son in this sense, that Loas Abaseinu Govad, not only were our forefathers redeemed, Ala'af Osana Golim, we were also redeemed, that's applicable to any person who's alive, any Jew who's alive. Chacham, Rasha, if he's here, that means he was redeemed. So we're dealing with two different things. Because when we speak about the B'chol Dor V'dar Chayavadam Lira Sasas, which is an exercise of the imagination, so a person who excludes himself from an exercise is excluded. So the father who's engaged in this imaginative experience, speaking to his son who's a Ben Rasha, can say, Balvur Zasa Hashem, leave it alone. Me and not you. I'm involved, you're not involved. But in the sense of Loas Avaseinu Bulvad Goal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the sense that it's a reality that HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeemed all the future generations, you can't exclude anybody. If the person is here, he was redeemed. So it's not only because that parsha happens to be speaking to a Ben Chacham, it happens to be that way. But in that sense, even if the father would be speaking to the Ben Rashi, he'd have to say that same thing. Right? That it's Osana Hotzi Misham, it's a reality that you were redeemed. Now, why is that important? Why is it important that the redemption was intended for each person? And Maral says something here, which is very, very cryptic. But it can be explained in light of another statement of Maral. Maral says like this. Maral says, if the redemption would have been fundamentally for those who were in Mitzrayim, and only secondary for their descendants, then those children could have been enslaved again. But because HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeemed the descendants directly, therefore they cannot be enslaved again. A little bit of a cryptic statement. But this is understood in light of something else which the Maharal says earlier in the Sefer Guras Hashem. This is a very interesting thing. Because we know that we celebrate the Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's a big thing in our life, in our culture. But the reality is, what are we celebrating? We know that we are not currently enjoying the freedom that was experienced then. There have been many exiles, many persecutions between then and now. The Golos Bavel, and the Golos Yavan, and the Golos Edom, and the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. I mean, in what sense can we say that we are savoring, we are enjoying the liberation that was experienced in Canada Mitzrayim? So the Maharal says a very, very interesting thing, and to fully understand it, we have to understand the Maharal Shita about how the world works. And the Maharal understands the following. The Maharal understands that there is a fundamental seder, there's a fundamental order to the way the world works. This is an order, a seder, which is conferred upon the world by the Ribono Shel Olam. And there can be temporary aberrations from this seder. There can be temporary departures from the Seder, but there is a tendency which is built into the Bria itself for things to revert back to their fundamental state. And the mashal I've given in the past is, imagine a rubber band. So a rubber band has a certain shape at rest. You can stretch the rubber band, because with the application of force you can distort its shape. But if you let go, it'll snap back to its original shape. So the Maharal says the same thing, that there's a Seder, there's an order in the Bria. It's true that with the application of force you can twist things out of shape, but there's a tendency for things to revert back. For example, the Maharal says in the Sefer Netzach Yisrael that the fundamental nature of a nation is that it should be autonomous, meaning subject to its own control, that it should be united, and that it should be rooted in its own land. Galus really is the suspension of these three ideas. In Galus, we lose our autonomy. We are subject to the control of other nations. We are dispersed, so we're no longer unified, and we're uprooted from our land. It says the Maharal, but our confidence that there will be a redemption is because we see Galus as a Yitziyah min HaSeder. It's an aberration from the natural order. And therefore there is a tendency within the Bria itself for things to snap back into shape. So it's true that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent us into Galus. But for a Jew to remain in Galus requires HaKadosh Baruch Hu's constant application of force to keep us in Galus. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu withdraws that force, things will snap back into position, and we'll find ourselves in Eretz Yisrael, independent, united, etc. In other words, it isn't that it'll be necessary to apply a force to bring about Geula. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu lets go of that force which keeps us in Galus, everything will snap back into shape. It's an amazing idea the Maharal says. Now the question is, at what moment in our history was this status of nationhood conferred upon Klal Yisrael? So the Maharal says this was at the moment of the Yetzias Mitzrayim. At the moment of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu conferred upon us the status of an Am. Until then we were not that way. Because we know the mashal that Chazal used for the Yetzias Mitzrayim is an interesting one. It says, O Hanisa Elokim Lavo Lokachs L'Goy Mikarav Goy. Did HaKadosh Baruch Hu ever do such a thing to remove a nation from within a nation? So what's the mashal? The mashal is the cattle herder delivering a calf. So you have the cow, and the cow has a calf, and sometimes it's necessary for the cattleman to intervene to deliver the calf. If you ever read the books of James Herriot, you know, the famous English veterinarian, all his stories all begin with he's delivering a calf. Seems almost that's the only thing he ever did. But it's necessary to have this intervention. So we were a guy mikarav guy. We were like that calf in the cow of Mitzrayim. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu delivered us. So the Maharal says, like, what is the meaning of that mashal? What are Chazal trying to point out? Well, just like in the case of the calf has no independent existence until the moment of delivery. And that's really what happened. In other words, until the Yetzias Mitzrayim, we were very much like a fetus in the body of the cow. With the Yetzias Mitzrayim, we were delivered. At that moment, that's when we became an Am in our own right. And it's at that moment that the status of autonomy was conferred upon us, unity, our right to a homeland. And therefore says the Maharal that every subsequent redemption is rooted in the Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's the status that was conferred upon us at the Yetzias Mitzrayim is realized in subsequent generations. It's true there are interruptions. The interruptions are aberrations. The Golus Bubble is an aberration. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to apply force to bring us in the Golus Bubble. The Golus Yavin, the Golus Edom, these are all interventions. But we snap back to our original position. But when was that original position conferred upon us? At the moment of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And therefore every period of geula that we experience and will experience is rooted in that which occurred at the moment of the Yetzias Mitzrayim. So says the Maral, now let's go back. That therefore, if we're discussing ourselves, for example, our hopes for Moshe Mashiach, it must be that the status of geula was conferred upon us. It can't be that it was conferred merely upon our great-great-great-grandfathers, because then that wouldn't do anything for us. It means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the moment that Yetzias Mitzrayim, conferred the status of nationhood on Jews for all time. And that's the shirish, that's the root of our ultimate redemption. That wouldn't have been the case if it would have been merely conferred upon the Yotzei Mitzrayim, and we'd just be the secondary beneficiaries of that. And therefore it had to be that it was done for all generations. That only could be done by the Ribono Shel Olam. A shliach, a malach, can only act upon that which is in front of him. But to be able to act upon something which is, as we say in the Gemara, a davar shelo ba la'olam, a thing which does not yet exist, that's only something which the Ribono Shel Olam can do. And therefore, says the Maral, that's why the geula from Mitzrayim had to be HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvodo v'atzmo. Why? Because it had to be for all time. And in order for it to be for all time, that's something only HaKadosh Baruch Hu could do.
But we're still dependent on Hashem. If you use the cow and the calf example, even though we're still dependent on Him, even though we're separated. So.
That's what we're saying. But what the Maral was saying is that it isn't that the calf is a reference to the Jews of that generation. The calf is the reference to the Jews of each generation. Each generation, even our own generation, we are the calf that was redeemed at the Yetzias Mitzrayim. And therefore, that's only something HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvodo v'atzmo can do, says the Maral. So again, just to sum up what we said. In other words, we really said some very important ideas. That in the B'chol Dor V'dor Chaya V'dom Liros Atzmo, there really are two different ideas. There's an idea that it's an experience of the imagination in order to vividly depict the miracles and wonders and to be inspired by them. That's something which, if you're involved, you're involved. You're not involved, you're not involved. So the Ben Chacham is, the Ben Rasha isn't. Therefore, there can be exclusions. But in the sense of the reality being that HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeemed every generation, there are no exclusions. Any Jew who is here is a Jew who was redeemed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly. That's why when you speak to any son, you say Va'osanu Hotzi Misha. And furthermore, that's something which only HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself can do. Because a malach, a shliach, can only act on that which is in front of him. He can't act on something which doesn't yet exist. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who's the creator of all things, can act directly on the things that have not yet been brought into existence. And therefore, since HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Yetzias Mitzrayim is not redeeming the Jews from Mitzrayim, he's redeeming the Jews for all time. Even the geula of Moshe Mashiach is rooted in the Yetzias Mitzrayim. Therefore, it has to be HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvodo v'atzmo. This is what the Maral says. Okay, now getting back to the original question. Since the geula has to be HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvodo v'atzmo, so what does that mean about Moshe Rabbeinu? What was precisely the role of Moshe Rabbeinu? Now Moshe Rabbeinu, we know a very, very interesting thing about him. The midah which exemplified Moshe Rabbeinu is the midah of anava. Anava to the extreme, selflessness to the extreme. But Moshe Rabbeinu is a person who takes no credit for himself, who thinks nothing of himself. The Gemara in Chulun says that Gadol Mashenamar b'Moshe, that what it says about Moshe Rabbeinu, the humility of Moshe Rabbeinu, is greater than that which it says about Avraham Avinu, and also in that Gemara greater than what it says about David HaMelech. David HaMelech, when he talked about himself, said, "Anochi telas v'layish," I am a worm and not a man. And that's a very, very high level of self-negation. But a worm also is a living thing. Living thing. Avraham Avinu said, "Anochi afar v'efer," I am dirt and ashes. Not even a living thing. Dirt, ashes. Moshe Rabbeinu said, "V'nachnu mo." What are we? We're nothing. Garnished. Nothing. So that's the highest level of self-negation. Moshe Rabbeinu. And why was this necessary? Why was it important that Moshe Rabbeinu be such an onav? Now we know there are two major roles that Moshe Rabbeinu plays in the history of Klal Yisrael. First, he is the redeemer from Mitzrayim. He's involved in the process of Yetzias from Mitzrayim. And secondly, he is the one who revealed Torah to us. Now, in the sense of him being the agent through whom we receive the Torah, we understand why it's important that he be totally selfless. Because we have to have confidence that the Torah that Moshe transmitted to us is the exact same Torah that the Rebbeinu Shalom gave him. In other words, you've probably heard this from me many times. I've said it more times than I should have. But I once saw somewhere that there was a person who wrote a Yiddish translation of Shakespeare. And on the title page, they printed Shakespeare verteidigt und verbessert. Shakespeare translated and improved. If a Jew would write a translation of Shakespeare, he would imagine that it's better than the original. So the Torah could be the same thing. It's Torah verteidigt und verbessert. Torah translated and improved. Because we have to have confidence that the person who is the seersor, the person who is the agent through whom Torah is transmitted, is a person who will transmit it exactly as it was given by the Rebbeinu Shalom. There is no personal commentary, there's no editing involved. It's exactly as HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave it. And therefore, the person who would be the Torah, the person who would give Torah to Klal Yisrael, had to be a person who had this quality of total anava and total selflessness. And the reality is this way. The reality is, even when we learn Torah, to understand Torah means we have to put aside our own preconceived notions. Whereas if we come to the study of Torah with a set of assumptions, our own deep-rooted assumptions, to the extent that we read something in the Torah and we say, that makes no sense, because we all know X, Y, Z. So the Torah states the contrary. It means we're not open to hear what HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to say, because we are determined to uphold that which we've believed for years. So, let's say, for example, you have a certain political philosophy. Let's say you believe in democracy, and you discover that the Torah's system of government hardly seems democratic. The Torah poses a monarchy, and there is no popular legislature. There's no representation of the people. There are no elections. But what's going on? It's contrary to everything I believe in. So that's a problem. The problem is you have to do the opposite. You have to conform your thinking to that of the Torah, not vice versa. Or let's say a person doesn't believe in gender differences. A person believes that men and women are fundamentally alike. And you come to the Torah and you see that the Torah really defines roles, different roles to men, women, etc. So you approach the Torah and you say, there's a big question over here. No, it's not. There's a big question over here. You have to be open to what the Torah says, and see maybe that your preconceived notions have to be corrected themselves. So we understand that in Torah, anava is a very, very important precondition. But I think in Geula it's also an important precondition. And this is based on a famous Maimer Chazal. Chazal say that Kol ha'omer davar b'shem ha'omro maybe Geula la'olam. If a person says something in the name of the person who said it, when he attributes a quote, he gives proper credit to the person who said it, that person brings Geula to the world. How do we know this? It says in Megillah Esther that when Bigsan and Seresh plotted against Achashverosh, it says that Esther reported this to the king b'shem Mordechai, in Mordechai's name, and as a result the Geula followed. So the question is this like the biggest source, the biggest merit that a person says something b'shem Omro, that Geula should come? By the way, I'll mention a very interesting thing that Irving Bunim writes in his book on Pirkei Avos on this Mishnah. Now, there's a very interesting practice in Jewish life that when speakers get up, whatever the topic of the speech is, they always end with a prayer that Mashiach should come. The speaker may have been speaking about Shabbos, or maybe speaking about kashrus, or maybe speaking about Jewish politics, and he'll end and say, and so it shall be, Ad bi as goyal tzedek until Mashiach comes, b'meher of Yameinu, amen. So why do all speeches end the same way? So one answer to that question is because people don't know how to end the speech. So my wife sometimes points out that I have a problem ending. So she gives a muscle. It's like sometimes a plane can't land; it has to circle for a while, and finally it comes in. So I have the problem too. So that's what some people say. But he says a different shot. He says like this. He says because many of the darshanim were guilty of this crime. Or they would say things that they saw in Svarim and say them in their own names. So that should prevent the Gula. If saying Davar B'Shem Omro brings the Gula, so not saying things B'Shem Omro could delay and defer the Gula. So therefore, to make up for that, they would always end the drasha with the prayer that Mashiach should come to compensate for what they may have done during the drasha. Okay. But why is this so important? So Maral says an amazing thing. He says it doesn't mean that the schus of saying Davar B'Shem Omro is so important it brings the Gula. It means like this. It means that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu selects a person to be the agent of redemption, what type of person does he select? He selects the person who has this quality of Omer Davar B'Shem Omro. Why? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants that if there's going to be a Gula, credit should be given where credit is due. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought the Geula, so then we should attribute it to him. So therefore, who does HaKadosh Baruch Hu choose as the agent of Geula? A person who takes the credit for himself? I try to avoid politics. Very much so. But when Vice President Biden gets up, right, and says that one of the great successes of the Obama administration is going to be democracy in Iraq, you see how preposterous this is and how deep-rooted this tendency to give oneself credit is. And we're talking about a policy which he personally opposed, which his president personally opposed at every junction, every vote, and clearly the success of the U.S. policy in Iraq is rooted in the determination of the Bush administration, and now things are finally coming to a successful conclusion. They're going to take the credit for themselves. This is going to be one of the great successes of the Obama administration. So that's what Chazal are telling us. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu selects an agent of Geula, he doesn't take the person who gives himself the credit. He takes the person who is willing to give credit to others. So the question is, then how do you test that? You test it in small ways. If a person says a vertical, and he says it in the name of the person who said it, that shows he has this quality. He gives credit where credit is due, etc. And that's, of course, the quote from Ronald Reagan, the famous quote. I can't paraphrase I can't say the words exactly, but he says something like this, that there's no limit to what you can accomplish if you're willing to give the credit to somebody else. And therefore, a person who's willing to give credit where credit is due, that person is the agent of the Geula. And therefore, in the Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's no exception. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu used Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Shliach. He went to Paro. But it was a person who would give credit where credit is due. And therefore, you have to be that person who was the Anav Mikol Adam, the most humble of all people. So therefore, the Haggada emphasizes the fact that it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'chvodo v'atzmo and totally marginalizes Moshe Rabbeinu. But it's really more than that. It's not just that Moshe Rabbeinu is marginalized because we want to emphasize HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's marginalized because he himself would have wanted that. And that's something we learned from this week's parsha. We just finished Parshas Vayikra. So Vayikra, the first word is Vayikra, with the Aleph Ze'ira, the very small Aleph. So the Baal Turim brings, it's really from the Medrash, that Moshe Rabbeinu did not want to write Vayikra. The word Vayikra implies that HaKadosh Baruch Hu invited Moshe Rabbeinu, he called Moshe Rabbeinu for this conversation. as if Moshe Rabbeinu is someone deserving of the honor, as if he's a person who has prepared himself properly for the prophetic experience. Moshe wanted to write Vayikar, as is written in the case of Bilam, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu just chanced upon Bilam and therefore spoke to him. Like he bumped into him. And if it wouldn't have been for this chance encounter, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't have spoken to him. And Moshe Rabbeinu felt that he was not any more deserving than Bilam. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, no, you have to write Vayikra. It's not true. You are more deserving than Bilam. And Moshe Rabbeinu protested. So finally the pshara was, the compromise was, they write Vayikra with a small aleph. So it could be read Vayikar if you ignore the aleph, but the aleph is there to show that it's a Vayikra. Now obviously it isn't that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it differently. It's that HaKadosh Baruch Hu relented to what Moshe Rabbeinu wanted. It's telling you HaKadosh Baruch Hu does what those who fear him want. So Moshe Rabbeinu wanted that this point should be not emphasized, the Vayikra. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu was masking, HaKadosh Baruch Hu consented to the aleph ziva. This is the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu is not just that Moshe Rabbeinu is humble. He doesn't want attention called to himself. He doesn't want to be presented in the Torah as a person who is of such magnificent stature. And therefore in Haggada it's the same thing, that Moshe Rabbeinu is not mentioned. It's not just that Moshe Rabbeinu is left out because we want to emphasize that it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chodim V'Atzmo. Moshe Rabbeinu undoubtedly doesn't want to be there. If you'd ask Moshe Rabbeinu, would you like to have your name mentioned? He says, no, he wouldn't want his name mentioned. He doesn't want to detract from the reality that it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chodim V'Atzmo. By the way, there is one place where Moshe's name is mentioned. There's a verse which Agav mentions the Aminu Shem Moshe Abdo, so there's one reference, but it's only by the way. But in the story itself it's not mentioned, because this is really what he would have wanted. He would not want that there should be any distraction from the reality of the fact that this gula was a gula that was performed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Ba'atzma. So Moshe Rabbeinu only saw himself as a mouthpiece. He's the messenger boy. He's the one who conveyed the messages between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Para. But really the redemption was HaKadosh Baruch Hu 1,000% himself. So this is a thought on that very, very important question why Moshe Rabbeinu isn't there. And we have to understand that we are the beneficiaries of Yetzias Mitzrayim because it was HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Chvod V'Atzma. And freedom is understood on many levels. There's political freedom, freedom from oppression, relief from the tribulations of Golus. But Golus is also a state of mind, and Gula is a state of mind. We talk about the three aspects of Golus that we mentioned: the loss of autonomy, the loss of unity, and not being rooted in Eretz Yisrael. This is really true on the personal level as well. In other words, a human being is meant to be independent in his thinking, independent in his motives. He's meant to be unified, which means that every aspect of his personality, every part of his time, is devoted to achieving his purpose in this world, and he's meant to be rooted in the sources of his spiritual sustenance. In other words, we find ourselves in a personal golus. We find ourselves suffering from a loss of autonomy. We are not the masters of our own thinking. Our values are often what we read in the newspapers, what we pick up from the media, what we find everyone else doing and thinking. We are not unified. Most of us find ourselves torn in the several directions. We want to have our cake and eat it too. Because we want to be good Jews, we want to be good Canadians, we want to worship in the basic Knesset, we want to worship at the Hockey Hall of Fame, we want to we want to have it all. And we often find ourselves cut off from the sources of our spiritual unique, our spiritual sustenance. We find ourselves cut off from Torah, from Talmid Chachamim, from sources of inspiration. The role that Eretz Yisrael could play in our lives is often diminished. First of all, simply by the fact that we are here, and even when we have the privilege of going, do we really take advantage of the opportunities that Eretz Yisrael presents? Do we get sidetracked? Baruch Hashem, over the last years I've gotten to go to Eretz Yisrael, and whenever I go, so even though I'm going for a very short time, there is this tradition. I don't know where it's brought, what safer it's brought, that when you come back, you have to bring presents. Right? So it comes out that I'm in Eretz Yisrael for all of 5 days. 1 day has to be spent walking down Rechov Bnei Yashar with all these gift shops. What am I going to buy for this kid and for that? In other words, we go to Eretz Yisrael and we get so sidetracked, in things that we could do in Chutz La'aretz. We don't take advantage of the spiritual opportunities that Eretz Yisrael provides, even when we are there. And certainly, when we're not there, we're cut off. So, what we have to do in the process of Geula is really reverse that. We have to become autonomous, independent in our thinking. In other words, that we're not going to be subject to thinking thoughts simply because that's what everyone else is thinking. We have to be unified. We have to integrate every aspect of our lives and direct them all to the single purpose of achieving our tachlis, which is to be double to the Ribbono Shel Olam, to serve the Ribbono Shel Olam. And finally, we have to attach ourselves to the sources of our spiritual sustenance, right, and not allow our neshamas to shrivel for lack of nourishment. And Pesach, which is Man Chayruseinu, it's a time of Geula, is a time which is mesugel for that. Because if we're not able to achieve Geula on the national level, at least we can hopefully achieve Geula on the individual, personal level. And we have to know that our ability to do that is rooted in the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the very outset, made this a time of Geula and conferred upon us the potential for redemption. So it's a very, very challenging time, but a time that tremendous things could be accomplished. And the Hashem should save us from the distractions. That we shouldn't be distracted by the eating and the food and the Chalamaya trips, the inane Chalamaya trips. But rather we should be able to use that Pesach as a time for spiritual growth, and hopefully, Be'ez Hashem, there should be a meaningful Pesach for all of us.